You have burned cities that once seemed eternal. You have conquered the greatest empire the world has ever known. And yet, here, at the banks of the Hydaspes River, you cannot take another step. The sun does not shine here. It presses. It is a physical weight, a heavy hand pushing down on your shoulders, forcing your knees to buckle. The heat in the Indian summer of 326 BC is not like the dry, crisp heat of home. It is alive. It sweats out of the earth. It clings to your skin, turning your linen tunic into a second, rotting layer of skin. My name is Callius. I'm a veteran of the Companion Cavalry. I've seen the blood of Darius stain the dust of Gaugamela. I've watched Alexander ride into the fire at the Granicus. I've felt the ground shake under the hooves of 10,000 horses. But I never felt fear like this. Look at my feet. The sandals are gone. The leather has rotted away in the mud or been torn off by the rocks. My soles are calloused into leather, cracked and bleeding. Every step is a negotiation with pain. The bronze armor that once made us invincible now weighs a ton. It is hot as a furnace. The sweat does not evaporate. It pools in the creases of my elbows, in the small of my back, under the chin. It itches. It burns. It never stops itching. We are camped on the banks of the Hydaspes. This is the Bees River, as the locals call it. It's the easternmost point of our journey. To the west lies the path we have carved through blood and fire. To the east lies the unknown. The scouts have returned. They did not speak. They could not. They simply pointed east, their eyes wide with the terror that no enemy had ever inspired in us before. They spoke of the Nanda Empire. They spoke of a land so rich in gold that the dust itself seemed to shimmer. But they also spoke of the army, 200,000 infantry, 6,000 war elephants. Inside the royal tent, the air is different. It is still. The heavy scent of frankincense and myrrh chokes out the smell of the jungle. Here, the silence is louder than the roar of the river. Alexander sits on a low stool, his head in his hands. He is not the triumphant hero we saw at Issus. He is not the young man who laid a wreath at the tomb of Achilles at Troy. He is a ghost of a king. His face is hollowed by sleeplessness. His eyes, once bright with the fire of conquest, are dull, haunted by a dream he cannot wake from. He is waiting for Hephaestion. He is always waiting for Hephaestion. Hephaestion enters. He moves with the quiet grace of a man who carries the weight of the world without bending. He is the only one who can walk into this tent and not feel the tension snap like a bowstring. Hephaestion is my friend. He is the anchor. While Alexander dreams of gods and glory, Hephaestion counts the grain. He maps the rivers. He negotiates with the local chieftains, speaking their languages, respecting their customs, keeping the fragile peace that holds our retreat together. He is the mind to Alexander's heart, the steady hand to the king's volatile fire. The men are restless, Alexander, Hephaestion says. His voice is low, soothing. They are sitting in the dust. They are not packing. Alexander does not look up. Let them sit, he whispers. Let them remember their homes. Perhaps if they remember, they will find the strength to go on. But they do not remember strength. They remember peace. I close my eyes, and for a moment the heat vanishes. I am in Pella. The air is crisp, cool, and clean. It smells of olive groves and dry stone. The sun is bright, but it does not punish. It warms. I can hear the wind in the cypress trees. I can taste the cool water from the mountain springs. I can feel the simple, heavy loaf, bread, dry and honest. I can taste the wine, sharp and red, shared with friends who are still alive. We left that life. We left the olive groves for the dust of Persia. We left the cool winds for the suffocating jungles of India. We did it for glory. We did it because Alexander showed us the map, and we saw the edge of the world, and we thought, there. But glory is a strange thing. It changes. Remember the bat, Leia Vesis. The dust was different then. It was dry, fine, and golden. The sun was high. We were the storm. After the battle, the Persian royal family was captured. Darius's mother, Sisygambes, was terrified. She'd heard of the great king Alexander. When the two of them entered her tent, she fell to her knees before Hephaestion. She mistook him for the king. Hephaestion was taller, broader, and perhaps more handsome. Me in his youth. He stood there, confused, as the queen of Persia begged for mercy at his feet. Alexander laughed. He did not correct her. He said, "He is also an Alexander." It was a joke, but it was also a testament to their bond. In that moment, Hephaestion was not just a friend, he was a king in his own right. He was the shield to Alexander's sword. But that was years ago. That was in a land of sun and open field. That was before the elephants, before the Nanda, before the Hydaspes. Now the laughter is gone. The jungle is not a field, it is a green hell. The trees are so tall they block the sky. The vines are thick as ropes. The insects are the size of hands. The diseases are invisible killers that strike without warning. We are no longer conquerors. We are refugees in our own domain. We are trapped in a wet, rotting LD that does not want us. Look at the men around me. They are sitting in the dust. Their spears are leaned against their knees. Their shields are on the ground. They are not looking at me. They are looking east. Their eyes are not filled with ambition. They are filled with fear. The scouts brought back stories that sound like nightmares. They spoke of the Nanda king, Dhanananda. They said he was a man of infinite weak, Altal, but also infinite cruelty. They said his army was so large that it stretched beyond the horizon. But it was not the infantry that terrified them. It was the elephants. 6,000 war elephants. Imagine it. 6,000. Each one a moving fortress, armored in steel, carrying towers of archers on its back. Each one a creature of such power that it could crush a phalanx like a grape. The Hydaspes is not just a rock in the stick. A Hydaspes is not just a rocks, either. It is a line drawn by the gods. It is the boundary between the known and the unknowable. For years, our discipline was our armor. We were the iron wall. The Macedonian phalanx, with its long sarissas, was an unbreakable line of iron. We believed that if we held the line, if we kept our formation, nothing could stop us. But the iron wall is showing cracks. The heat is rusting the iron. The humidity is rotting taunt. Eat wood. The fear is breaking the spirit. Kona stands up. He's a veteran general, a man who has fought beside Alexander since the days of Philip. He's pragmatic. He's loyal. But he's also the voice of the army. He looks at the men. He sees the exhaustion in their eyes. He sees the rotting sandals. He sees the hunger. He knows that if Alexander orders us to cross this river, we will not march. We will not fight. We will simply die in the mud, waiting for the end. Conius walks toward the royal tent. He does not run. He does not shout. He walks with the slow, deliberate step of a man who knows he is speaking for the dead as well as the living. Inside the tent, Alexander hears the footsteps. He knows who it is. He feels a surge of anger, hot and sharp. He wants to scream. He wants to order the execution of the ringleaders. He walks and to force them forward with the lash. But he does not. He knows that the lash will not work here. The men are too far gone. They're beyond anger. They're in the realm of sorrow. He waits. He listens to the wind outside. He listens to the river. And he waits for the voice that will change history. His murmurs are spreading. They are not loud. They are not violent. They are quiet, like the dripping of water in a cave. "We have gone far enough," one man whispers. "We want to go home," says another. "My brother died at the Hydaspes. I will not let my bones feed the Nanda soil," a third says. These words are poison. They are spreading through the camp like a fever. The iron wall is not broken yet, but it is bending. It is groaning under the weight of the sun, the weight of the distance, and the weight of the fear. The sun begins to set. The light turns from a blinding white to a bruised purple. The shadows of the trees stretch out across the camp, long and grasping, like the fingers of the jungle reaching for us. The air cools slightly, but the humidity remains. The smell of wet earth and decaying vegetation is overwhelming. It is the smell of death, slow and rotting. I look at my hands. They are dirty. They are scarred. They are tired. I think of Pella. I think of the olive groves. I think of the cool wine. I think of Hephaestion, standing tall and calm, trying to hold the empire together. I think of Alexander, sitting in the dark, trying to hold the world together. We are waiting. The army is waiting. The silence is heavy. It presses down on us, heavier than the bronze armor, heavier than the sun. We are no longer the invincible army of Alexander the Great. We are a group of exhausted men standing on the edge of the world, looking into the dark. And we are afraid. The mutiny is not a shout, it is a silence. It is the refusal to move. It is the staring at the river, and then the turning away. The iron wall has met its match, not in the elephants, not in the Nanda army, but in the human spirit. We are tired, we are broken, and we are done. The story of our conquest ends here, on the banks of the Hydaspes, in the heat, in the mud, in the fear. Alexander steps out of the tent. He looks small against the vastness of the Indian plains. He looks at his men. He sees the fear. He sees the resolve. He sees the end of his dream. The sun dips below the horizon. The stars begin to appear, cold and distant. The river flows on, indifferent to our triumphs and our failures. We turn our backs on the east. We turn our backs on the Nanda. We turn our backs on the glory. We look west. We look home. The iron wall is broken, but we are still alive. And for now, that is enough. The night falls, the jungle breathes, and the long way home begins. But that is a story for another time. For now, rest. Let the heat fade. Let the few sleep. Let the memory of the iron wall drift away into the darkness. Sleep now. The river flows. The stars watch. And you are safe. You are home. Good night. The sky had been black that night, choked with clouds that promised a storm. The thunder did not roll, it crashed, a deafening boom that shook the very ground beneath their sandals. Alexander had chosen the night of the monsoon to cross. It was madness. It was genius. It was the kind of gamble that only a man who believed he was the son of Zeus would make. The rain fell in sheets, blinding and cold, turning the river into a churning beast of brown water and white foam. Callias remembered the feeling of the spear in his hand, slick with rain and sweat. He remembered the fear in his gut, a cold stone that sat heavy and unyielding, had crossed in silence, rowing through the darkness, the oars dipping into the water with a rhythmic splash, splash, splash that sounded like a heartbeat. Every man held his breath, waiting for the roar of the enemy, for the lights of Porus's camp to appear in the mist. But there was only the rain, only the river, only the terrifying unknown. They had made landfall on the opposite bank, a muddy, treacherous slope that slicked under their feet. They had formed the phalanx in the dark, the Cereses those long, 12-foot spears bow, inting forward like a forest of iron thorns. The Macedonian line was a wall of bronze and wood, disciplined and rigid. It was the wall of iron, the formation that had crushed Persia, that had toppled Darius, that had made kings tremble in their beds, from Egypt to the Indus. Then, the mist lifted, and the world ended. They did not see an army at first. They saw monsters, rising from the riverbank, taller than the tallest oak, were the elephants. Dozens of them, then hundreds. They moved with a slow, terrifying grace, their gray skin wrinkled like ancient leather, their tusks curved like scimitars of ivory. They wore armor of bronze and iron, bells hanging from their necks that jingled with a cheerful, lyric sound against the grim reality of their size. The sound hit them before the sight did, a low infrasonic rumble that vibrates, aided in the chest, in the bones, in the teeth. It was a sound that bypassed the ears and went straight to the fear center of the brain. The trumpeting that followed was a shriek of rage and power, a sound that tore at the sky. The horses of the companion cavalry, the finest war horses in the world, reared and screamed, throwing their riders. The wall of iron wavered. For the first time in history, the Macedonian phalanx felt small. Callias remembered the first charge. The elephants did not run. They walked with purpose, a grinding, unstoppable force. The sarissas, designed to pierce the thin shields of Persian infantry, snapped against the thick, hide-covered shoulders of the beasts. Spears broke. Men were lifted off their feet and tossed aside like rag dolls. The ground shook with every step. A rhythmic thud, thud, thud drowned out the battle cries. The discipline held, but barely. The phalanx was a geometric shape in a world of organic chaos. The elephants broke the geometry. They punched holes in the line, trampling men and horses, turning the orderly ranks into a swirling mess of panic and blood. The air filled with the smell of crushed vegetation, of copper blood, and of the musky animal scent of the giants. Callias had fought back to back with his friend, Lysander. He remembered the wake of Lysander's body as he fell, crushed by a tusk. He remembered the look in the eyes of the Mahout, the Indian driver, sitting high in the howdah, calm and focused, guiding the beast with a small, sharp hook. 'Twas no hatred in the Mahout's eyes, only a professional mastery of a force of nature that the Greeks could not comprehend. It was a battle, terror against terror. The Macedonians fought with the desperation of men who knew that to stop moving was to die. They threw javelins into the soft underbellies of the elephants. They used their swords to hack at the legs. It was brutal, intimate, and horrifying. The wall of iron was bent, twisted by the pressure, but it did not shatter. Not yet. When the smoke cleared, the field was a graveyard of gray and red. The elephants lay dead or dying, their trumpeting replaced by the low groans of the dying. The Macedonians had won, but they had not conquered. They had survived. Alexander had walked through the field, his armor stained with mud and blood. He had found Porus, the Indian king, sitting on a chariot, wounded, his body broken, but his spirit unyielding. The two men had looked at each other across the carnage. There was no triumph in Alexander's eyes, only a profound, weary respect. "How'd you wish to be treated?" Alexander had asked. Porus had looked at him, his breath ragged, and said, "Treat me as a king should treat another king." Alexander had laughed, a dry, humorless sound, and had reinstated Porus as a satrap, giving him even more land than he had before. There was a moment of honor, a glimpse of the hero they had once been. Utah as Alexander rode away. Callias had seen the look in his commander's eyes. It was not the look of a victor. It was the look of a man who had seen the limit of his power. The memory faded, leaving behind the oppressive heat of the present. The sun was high now, beating down on the muddy banks of the Hydaspes. The air was still, heavy with humidity that made every breath feel like a struggle. Callias sat on a rock, his bronze cuirass feeling like a furnace on his chest. He wiped sweat from his eyes, his fingers trembling slightly. The silence of the camp was different now. It was not the silence of anticipation, but the silence of exhaustion. The soldiers were not standing at attention. They were sitting in groups, leaning on their spears, their heads bowed. The iron wall of discipline was showing its cracks. The rumors had stopped, spread through the camp like a disease, faster than any fever. They had heard the scouts return. They had heard the tales of what lay beyond the Hydaspes, the Nanda Empire. A land of infinite wealth, yes, but also a military machine of staggering proportions. 200,000 infantry, 6,000 war elephants, more than 10 times the size of Porus's army. Callias looked east, toward the direction of the rumors. He imagined the landscape beyond the river, the Gangetic plains, lush, green, and terrifyingly vast. He imagined the Nanda army, a sea of steel and ivory, moving with a precision that made Porus's forces look like a disorganized mob. The Nandas were rich in iron. Their weapons were not the bronze of the Greeks, but superior steel. The technological disparity added a new layer of dread to the fear. It was not just the size of the enemy, it was the quality of their power. "They say the Nanda king has 10,000 elephants," whispered a young soldier next to Callias. The boy's voice was thin, cracking with fear. "They say they have chariots that can cut through a phalanx like a scythe through wheat." Callias did not answer. He did not need to. The fear was in the air, thick and palpable. He remembered the crisp air of Pella, white stone buildings, the olive groves that smelt of sun and dust. He remembered the simple life he had left behind, the clean bread, the cool wine, the cold winds of winter that bit at the skin, a pain that was honest and clear. War in Macedon had been a thing of sunlight and open fields. It was a contest of wills, of formations of individual bravery. It was civilized in its own brutal way. But this was a watering descent into the primordial. The jungle was an enemy that watched you, that hid in the shadows, that whispered in the leaves. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on their souls. The disease, the dysentery, the fevers, they were silent killers that took men without a sound. The Macedonian ideal of glory felt like a joke now. What glory was there in dying of thirst in the desert? What glory was there in being trampled by a beast that was larger than a house? They were no longer conquerors. They were refugees in their own campaign. They were men who had walked too far, who had reached the edge of the map and found nothing but a wall of fear. Alexander had tried to keep the dream alive. He had spoken of the ocean river, of the ends of the earth, of joining with Achilles, but his voice had grown thinner, more strained. The men had stopped looking at him with awe. They looked at him with pity and with resentment. In the royal tent, the air was thick with incense, a cloying scent meant to mask the smell of the camp. Alexander sat on a low stool, his head in his hands. He looked older than his years. The lines around his eyes were deep, carved by sleepless nights and endless worry. He was not the triumphant hero of the early campaigns, was the man haunted by the ghost of Achilles, struggling to reconcile his Homeric ideals with the gritty, exhausting reality of his army. Tefestian stood by the tent flap, his face calm and composed. He was the anchor, the only one who could approach Alexander without fear. He held a scroll in his hand, a report from the scouts, but he did not read it. He watched his friend, his brother in all but blood. "They will know. Go, Alexander," Hephaestion said softly. His voice was steady, devoid of judgment. "They are broken. You can command them to die, but you cannot command them to live for a dream they no longer believe in." Alexander did not look up. "They are my men," he said, his voice hollow. "They swore an oath to the king, to the glory. They swore an oath to the men beside them," Hephaestion replied. "And right now their men are telling them to go home." Alexander sighed, a long, ragged exhale that seemed to deflate his entire body. He knew Hephaestion was right. He could feel the shift in the camp, the subtle change in the energy. The loyalty was fraying, the iron wall was rusting away, not from battle but from the relentless, grinding pressure of the environment and the sheer, overwhelming scale of what lay ahead. Outside, Conus stood up. The veteran general was a mountain of a man, his face weathered by 20 years of campaigning. He had fought at Granicus, at Issus, Gaugamela. He had seen it all, and he knew when a campaign was over, even if the king did not. He walked through the rows of tents, his boots crunching on the dry earth. The soldiers watched him, their eyes wide and fearful. They knew what was coming. They were waiting for him to give them permission to do what they already wanted to do. Caevenus did not shout. He did not rage. He simply spoke, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Men of Macedon," he said, "look at your hands, look at your armor. It is worn, it is thin. We have bled for this man. We have crossed continents for this dream. But we are tired, we are old, and we miss our homes." A murmur ran through the crowd. A Sioux, end of agreement and relief. Caevenus continued, his tone firm and pragmatic. "Nothing in excess is ever good. We have gone too far. It is better to return home with our success than to risk losing everything in the face of a power we cannot defeat. Let us ask the king to let us go home." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of meaning. It was the sound of a decision being made, not by one man, but by 3,000. The Iron Wall had met its match, not in the elephants, not in the Nanda army, but in the human spirit. They were tired, they were broken, and they were done. Callias felt a tear track through the dust on his cheek. He did not wipe it away. He looked at the men around him. He saw the same exhaustion in their eyes, the same longing for the cool shade of the olive groves. He saw the end of the dream, but he also saw the beginning of their survival. The mutiny was not a violent uprising. It was a passive, stubborn refusal to move. It was the staring at the river, and then the turning away. It was the packing of bags that remained half done. It was the silence that replaced the battle cries. The iron wall was broken, but they were still alive. And for now, that was enough. The story of their conquest ended here, on the cases of the Hydaspes, in the heat, in the mud, in the fear. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the camp. The stars began to appear cold and distant, indifferent to their triumphs and their failures. The river flowed on, a dark ribbon of water that reflected the sky. It did not care about kings or empires. It only cared about the flow. Alexander stepped out of the tent. He looked small against the vastness of the Indian plains. He looked at his men. He saw the fear. He saw the resolve. He saw the end of his dream. He did not speak. He did not rage. He simply nodded, a slow, heavy movement in his head. The relief in the camp was palpable, mixed with a profound sadness. They had won. They had conquered the known world. But they had also lost their purpose. They were going home, but they would never be the same men who had crossed the Hellespont. The wind from the east felt like a promise of the unknown, but they turned their backs on it. They turned their backs on the Nanda. They turned their backs on the glory. They looked west. They looked home. The iron wall is broken, but we are still alive. And for now, that is enough. The night falls, the jungle breathes, and the long way home begins. But that is a story for another time. For now, rest. Let the heat fade. Let the fear sleep. Let the memory of the iron wall drift away into the darkness. Sleep now. The river flows. The stars watch. And you are safe. You are home. The air in the camp at the Hydaspes did not move. It hung heavy and wet, a suffocating blanket of humidity that clung to skin and steel alike. The sun had long since vanished behind the dense screen wall of the jungle to the east. But the heat remained, trapped in the mud and the bodies of 50,000 men. It was a heat that did not just sit on the skin. It seeped into the bones. It was a heat that remembered the fire of the Hydaspes, and now it promised the fire of the Nanda. Callias sat him a flat stone near the riverbank. His spear lay across his knees, the bronze tip dull and scratched from weeks of use. He did not look at the river. He looked at his hands. They were trembling, not from fear, not exactly, but from a deep, vibrating exhaustion that had settled into his marrow. He rubbed his thumb over the rough wood of the spear shaft. He tried to remember the feel of dry olive wood from home. He tried to remember the crisp, cool air of pellet in the morning. But all he could smell was wet wool, musk, and the sweet, rotty scent of decaying jungle vegetation. The camp was silent. It was a silence that felt louder than any battle cry. There were no drills. There were no orders being shouted by the centurions. The soldiers sat in small, tight clusters. Some leaned against their shields, eyes closed. Others stared into the darkening trees, their faces pale and drawn. They were not packing. Their gear lay in piles, half folded, half tossed. The iron wall of their discipline was gone. In its place was a stubborn, silent refusal to move. Callias watched a young recruit, no older than 16, shivering despite the heat. The boy's sandals were falling apart, the leather straps frayed and muddy. He was chewing on a piece of dried meat, his eyes wide and vacant. Callias wanted to speak to him. He wanted to tell him to eat, to rest, to prepare for the march back. But he said nothing. The words felt heavy in his throat. To speak was to acknowledge the order. To acknowledge the order was to admit that there was still an army, and they were not. Not anymore. Across the camp, in the center of the royal encampment, the mood was different. It was not the silence of exhaustion, but the silence of tension. The royal tent was a fortress of purple canvas and gold trim, standing in stark contrast to the mud and rags of the common soldiers. Inside, the air was thick with the smoke of expensive incense. Cedar and myrrh burned in bronze censers, trying to mask the smell of sweat and despair. Alexander sat on a low stool, his head in his hands. He had not eaten. He had not slept. For 3 days he had remained in that tent. The door was closed. The guards stood outside, their spears crossed, looking uncomfortable and afraid. They were not guarding a king. They were guarding a ghost. The Alexander who had charged into battle at Granicus, who had wept at the tomb of Achilles, who had laughed with Hephaestion under the stars of Troy, was gone. In his place sat a man hollowed out by grief and rage. He remembered the face of Conus. The veteran general had stood before him, not with a sword drawn, but with his hands open and empty. Conus had looked at the king with eyes that held no fear, only a profound, heartbreaking pity. Conus had spoken the words that had shattered the world. Nothing in excess is ever good, he had said. His voice had been steady, like the tide. It is better to return home with a success than to risk losing everything. Alexander had laughed then, a harsh, brittle sound. He had shouted that they were not to turn back. He had spoken of glory. He had spoken of the ends of the earth. He had spoken of Achilles. But the words had fallen into the mud and died. The men had not moved. They had simply looked at him, and in their eyes, Alexander had seen the truth. They were not his soldiers anymore. They were refugees, and he was their captain, leading them into a grave. The memory of the Hydaspes flashed in high mind. He saw the elephants. He saw the gray, armored walls of flesh and bone. He heard the trumpeting, the low, infrasonic rumble that had vibrated in his chest and shaken his teeth. He saw the sarissas, the long spears, the symbol of Macedonian invincibility snap against the thick hide of the beasts. He saw the phalanx, the wall of iron, bend and break. Porus had stood there, towering, dignified, wounded. He had asked Alexander how he should be treated, and Alexander had answered with respect. He had reinstated him. He had shown mercy, but that mercy had cost him his army. The men had seen the elephants, and they had seen the terror. They had killed hundreds of them, but they knew, deep in their hearts, that Porus was only the beginning. Beyond him lay the Nanda Empire. 6,000 elephants, 200,000 infantry, land of infinite wealth and infinite danger. Hephaestion stood outside the tent. He was the only one who dared to approach. He leaned against the canvas, his face shadowed. He looked tired. His armor was dirty, his tunic stained with river mud. He had spent the last 3 days walking among the troops. He had spoken to them. He had listened to them. He had not offered false hope. He had offered only understanding. Hephaestion knew the weight of the moment. He knew that Alexander was not just a king. He was a friend. He was the boy from Pella who had shared his bread and his books. He was the man who had trusted him with his life at Issus, when the two were mistaken for one another in the chaos of battle. Hephaestion remembered that day. The dust, the confusion, the trust. But that was a lifetime ago. That was a different world. Now, Hephaestion was the anchor. He was the one who held the logistics together. He was the one who negotiated with the local chieftains, who arranged for food and water, who kept the army from dissolving into chaos. He was the steady hand in a storm, and now he had to break the king. He took a deep breath. The air was thick with the sound of the river. The water churned, dark and fast, flowing east toward the unknown. Hephaestion pushed open the tent flap. The incense hit him like a wall. Alexander did not look up. He was staring at a map on the ground, a map that showed the world ending at the edge of the paper. "Alexander," Hephaestion said. His voice was soft, but it cut through the silence. They are not moving. Alexander remained still. His shoulders were hunched. He looked small in the dim light. "Let them sit," he said. His voice was rough, unused. "Let them rot in the mud. I will not turn back. I am Alexander. I am the son of Zeus." Hephaestion walked over to the map. He did not touch it. He simply stood over it. "You are the son of Philip," he said gently, "and you are the friend of Hephaestion. And these men, they are the friends of us both. They are tired, Alex. They are broken. They love you, but they love their homes more." Alexander flinched. It was a small movement, but Hephaestion saw it. He saw the pain in the king's eyes. It was the pain of a man who had given everything and received nothing but exhaustion in return. He had wanted to be Achilles. He had wanted to be a god. But he was just a man, and his men were just men, and men have limits. Hephaestion knelt down. He placed a hand on Alexander's shoulder. The king did not pull away. He leaned into the touch. For a moment, they were just two boys from Pella, sitting in the dust, dreaming of glory. But the dream was dead. It had died in the heat of India. "We go home," Hephaestion said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. Like the rising sun, like the flowing river, we go home. We rest. We survive. We carry the memory of what we did, but we do not die here. Not for glory, not for a map, Alexander closed his eyes. A tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. He did not wipe it away. He let it fall. He let it fall into the mud of the map. He let it fall onto the edge of the Nanda Empire. 3 days, Alexander whispered. I have sat here for 3 days. I have fought my own men. I have fought my own heart, and I have lost. He looked up at Hephaestion. His eyes were red-rimmed. Haunted. Do they hate me? He asked. Hephaestion shook his head. No, he said. They do not hate you. They are afraid. They are tired. They miss their mothers. They miss the taste of cool wine. They miss the sound of the wind in the olive trees. They do not hate you, Alex. They just want to go home. Alexander nodded. Slowly, he reached out and took Hephaestion's hand. His grip was weak. That we go home. Died. The next morning, the camp did not erupt in cheers. There were no celebrations. There was only a profound collective exhale. The order had been given. They were turning back. The fear that had gripped their hearts for weeks began to loosen. It was replaced by a strange, melancholic relief. They were going home. They might not survive the journey. They might die in the desert. They might die in the rivers. But I were going home. Callias stood up. His legs were stiff. His joints ached. He picked up his spear. He looked at the pile of gear. He began to fold it, slowly, carefully. Around him, the other soldiers began to move. They did not rush. They moved with a slow, deliberate pace of men who have been given a second chance. They packed their shields. They checked their water skins. They looked at each other. There was no joy in their eyes. Only a quiet, shared understanding. They had faced the end of the world, and they had chosen life. Calenus walked through the camp. He did not shout. He did not command. He simply walked. He nodded to the men. He touched the shoulder of a young soldier. He checked the straps of a pack. He was the voice of the army, but now he was also its shepherd. He guided them back from the edge of the abyss. He knew that the road home would be hard. He knew that the Yggdrasian desert awaited. He knew that the heat would try to kill them again. But they were alive, and they were together. Alexander emerged from his tent. He looked different. The arrogance was gone. The divine aura was gone. He looked like a man. He wore simple Macedonian armor, not the Persian robes he had tried on in the past. He wore the cloak of a soldier. He walked to the riverbank. He stood there for a long time, looking east one last time. The jungle loomed behind him, dark and impenetrable. The Nanda Empire lay beyond. The 6,000 elephants waited in the shadows. He did not raise his sword. He did not make a speech. He simply turned his back on the east. He turned his back on the glory. He turned his back on the dream. He looked west. He looked toward the Indus. He looked toward home. Hephaestion stood beside him. He did not speak. He did not need to. They stood together, two men against the vastness of the Indian subcontinent. The wind blew from the east, warm and humid. It smelled of rain and earth. It smelled of the unknown. But they did not flinch. They had faced it, and they had chosen to live. The army began to move. It was not a march. It was a migration. 1,000 men and beasts moving in a slow, winding line along the riverbank. The elephants, those few that remained, walked heavily, their trunks swaying. The horses stumbled in the mud. The men walked with their heads down, their eyes fixed on the ground. They did not look at the sky. They did not look at the trees. They looked at the path. Callias walked behind his unit. He carried his pack on his back. It was he. It was familiar. He missed the weight. It was a weight he could understand. It was the weight of his gear. Not the weight of an empire. Not the weight of glory. Just the weight of his own survival. As they walked, the sounds of the jungle faded behind them. The birds stopped singing. The insects stopped chirping. It was as if the land itself was watching them leave. It was as if the land was saying, "Go. Not welcome here. You are too small. You are too weak. You are too tired." Callias thought of the Nanda iron weapons. He had seen the rumors. He had heard the scouts speak of the steel swords of the Magadha region. He had heard of the iron armor that shone like black mirrors. He had thought of the Macedonian bronze, which was dull and soft by comparison. He had thought of the fear that had gripped them. Not just the fear of the elephants, but the fear of the technology, the fear of the future. The Nandals were not just a large army. They were a civilization that had mastered the metal. They had mastered the land. They had mastered the beasts. The Macedonians were masters of the phalanx. They were masters of the spear. They were masters of the sun. But they were not masters of the jungle. They were not masters of the monsoon. Were not masters of the vastness. And that was why they had turned back. Not because they were cowards, but because they were human. The sun rose the next day. It was a pale, washed-out sun. It did not burn as fiercely as the day before. It seemed to shy away from the retreating army. The air was cooler. The mud was drier. The soldiers moved faster. There was a new energy in their steps. It was not the energy of conquest. It was the energy of escape. They were running from the dream, and they were running toward the truth. Hephaestion rode at the head of the vanguard. He looked back at the king. Alexander rode beside him. Alexander looked tired, but he looked clear. The haze of delirium was gone. The fog of ambition had lifted. He looked at Hephaestion. He nodded. "We will rebuild," Alexander said. His voice was quiet. "We will go to Babylon. We will rest. We will think. And then we will try again." Hephaestion looked at him with sadness. He knew that Alexander would never stop trying. He knew that the ghost of Achilles would never leave him. He knew that the dream would haunt him until the day he died. But for now, they were alive. And for now, that was enough. "We will go to Babylon," Hephaestion said. "We will rest, and we will be together." Alexander smiled. It was a small, sad smile. But it was real. "Yes," he said, "together." The journey home would be long. It would be brutal. They would have to cross the Indus. They would have to build bridges. They would have to navigate the treacherous waters. And then they would have to cross the Gedrosian desert, the sea of sand and death. The place where men would die of thirst, where the sun would blow into their skin, where the iron of their discipline would rust away. But that was a story for another time. For now, they were on the move. They were leaving the Hydaspes. They were leaving the elephants. They were leaving the Nanda. They were leaving the dream. King Alost looked back one last time. The river was a dark ribbon behind them. The jungle was a green wall. The stars were fading in the morning light. He turned, at his face to the west. He breathed in the air. It still smelled of mud and sweat, but it also smelled of possibility. It smelled of home. The iron wall was broken, but they were still alive. And for now, that was enough. The wind blew from the west. It was cool. It was dry. It smelled of dust and distance. It smelled of the long road ahead. Callias adjusted his pack. He tightened his grip on his spear, stepped with the men around him. They walked in silence, but it was a comfortable silence. It was the silence of men who knew they were not alone. They were a wall, not of iron, but of flesh, and they were moving. The sun rose higher. The shadows shortened. The camp at the Hydaspes was empty. The tents were gone. The fires were cold. Only the river remained, flowing east, indifferent, eternal. Alexander stood on a hill, overlooking the empty camp. He watched the dust settle. He watched the birds return to the tents. He watched the wind ripple through the grass. He felt the weight of the crown on his head. It felt heavy. It felt like a stone. He reached up and took it off. He held it in his hand. It was gold. It was ornate. It was the symbol of his power. And it felt empty. Hephaestion stood beside him. He did not speak. He simply eyed it. Alexander looked at the crown. He looked at the road. He looked at his friend. "Leave it," Hephaestion said. Alexander nodded. He placed the crown on the ground. He stepped back. He left it there, in the dust, in the grass, in the memory of the Hydaspes. He turned his back on it. He walked toward his horse. He mounted. He rode toward the west, toward the desert, toward the end of the dream. The army followed. 50,000 men, 50,000 souls, walking in the dust, walking in the heat, walking in the silence. They were not conquerors anymore. They were survivors, and that was a victory of a different kind. A victory that did not require glory. A victory that required only life. The iron wall was broken, but we are still alive. And for now, that is enough. The days blurred into weeks. The landscape hanged. The lush green of the jungle gave way to the dry, golden plains of the Punjab. The air became drier. The heat became sharper. The men grew thinner. The horses grew weaker. The elephants grew old and tired. But they moved. They did not stop. They did not turn back. They walked toward the river. They walked toward the bridges. They walked toward the unknown. Calius walked. He thought of Bela. He thought of olive groves. He thought of the cool wine. He thought of the simple life. He thought of the friends he had lost. He thought of the friends he had left behind. He thought of the future. He did not know what the future held. He did not know if he would see his home again. He did not know if he would see his mother again. He did not know if he would see Hephaestion again. But he knew that he was walking. And he knew that he was not alone. The river Indus loomed ahead. It was wide and fast. It was a barrier, but it was also a bridge. Hephaestion had been working on the bridges. He had been building. He had been creating order from chaos. He had been the anchor. Callias looked at the river. He saw the ships. He saw the bridges. He saw the activity. He saw the hope. He smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real. The iron wall was broken, but they were still alive. And for now, that was enough. Story of their conquest ended here. On the banks of the Hydaspes, in the heat, in the mud, in the fear, the night fell, the jungle breathed, and the long way home began. But that is a story for another time. For now, rest. Let the heat fade. Let the fear sleep. Let the memory of the iron wall drift away into the darkness. Sleep now. The river flock ows. The stars watch. And you are safe. You are home. The sun did not set in the Gadrosian desert. It hung, a white-hot coin, suspended in a sky that had forgotten the color blue. The air was not air at all. It was a heavy, dry blanket, woven from dust and heat, pressing against the skin, seaming the pores, stealing the breath from the lungs. Callias walked. His sandals were gone, lost to the thorns or the sand, so his feet were now maps of calluses and blisters, hardened into leather by weeks of suffering. He did not feel the ground. He only felt the weight of his shield, the rusted spear in his hand, and the hollow ache in his stomach that had become a permanent companion. This was the punishment. Or perhaps it was the price. Alexander had chosen this path, the direct route through the interior of the Gadrosian desert, a land of scorching winds and barren rock, was a decision born of pride, of a king who refused to take the longer, safer coastal road. He wanted to prove that the Macedonian legions could conquer not just men, but the earth itself. He wanted to show that the iron wall was not broken, but merely bent. But the desert did not care about bent walls. The desert only cared about water. And water was a memory. The army was divided. Hephaestion had taken the northern route along the coast of the Indus, building bridges, securing supply lines, and keeping the bulk of the army alive with the promise of ships and shade. He was the builder, the engineer, the man who could turn chaos into order. But Alexander had taken the southern half, the veterans, the elite, the men who had followed him from Pala to the edges of the known world. There were the tip of the spear, and now they were being driven into the fire. Callias looked at the man ahead. Alexander rode a black horse, its ribs showing through its coat, its eyes dull with exhaustion. The king wore his usual armor, but it was covered in a layer of fine, red dust that coated everything. His face was gaunt, his eyes shadowed, his beard unkempt. He looked less like a god and more like a ghost. He did not pay back. He did not speak. He only pointed forward, toward the horizon, where the heat shimmered and distorted the world into mirages of water and green trees. There was no water. There was no green. There was only the sand. The days blurred. Time lost its meaning. There was only the cycle of suffering. Dawn, when the light was pale and cruel, revealing the skeletons of camels and men that dotted the landscape. Noon, when the sun became a physical weight, pressing the soldiers into the ground. Dusk, when the heat did not break, but merely softened, allowing the men to crawl into the shade of rocks. gasping for air that was still too hot to breathe. Night, when the cold came, biting and sharp, stealing the warmth from bones that had no fat left to burn. They drank nothing but the muddy water they scraped from the bottom of dry rift water that tasted of salt and decay. They ate nothing but the roots they dug from the hard earth, roots that were tough and fibrous, tearing at their gums. The horses died first, then the mules, then the men. Callias watched his friend, a young hoplite named Lysander, fall one evening. Lysander had been walking beside him, joking about the wine they would drink in Pella. Then he stopped. He leaned on his speak. "Arr." He looked at Callias with wide, terrified eyes, and then he collapsed. He did not get up. Callias did not stop to check for a pulse. He knew. He kept walking. He had to keep walking. To stop was to die. The iron wall was rusting away. The discipline that had held them together, the unspoken agreement that they were an elite force, superior to all others, was dissolving in the heat. Men who had once marched in perfect exact formation now stumbled in a disorganized heap, dragging their feet, their eyes fixed on the ground, looking for any sign of life, any drop of moisture. The silence in the army was heavy. It was not a silence of respect or of fear or of anticipation. It was the silence of the dead, or of those who were already half dead. Alexander rode at the front, but he was not leading them with energy. He was leading them with a desperate, frantic energy, as if he believed that if he moved fast enough, he could outrun the heat, outrun the thirst, outrun the reality of their situation. He was haunted. Callias could see it in the way the king's hand rested on the hilt of his sword, not in readiness for battle, but in a grip so tight his knuckles were white. He was haunted by the memory of the elephants, haunted by the fear of the Nanda Empire, haunted by the knowledge that he had pushed them too far and that this desert was the consequence. But he did not turn back. He could not. To turn back would be to admit defeat, to admit that the iron wall had broken. And Alexander could not admit defeat. He was Alexander. He was the son of Zeus. He was the conqueror of Persia. He could not be the man who fled from the heat of a desert. So he pushed on. And he said, the men followed. Not out of loyalty, but out of habit. Out of the deep, ingrained conditioning that had been beaten into them since they were boys in the Paeonia. They walked because they did not know how to do anything else. Nights were the worst. Not because of the cold, but because of the thirst. Thirst is a strange thing. It starts in the throat, a dry scratch that makes swallowing painful. Then it moves to the tongue, which swells and fills the mouth, making speech impossible. Then it moves to the eyes, which become dry and gritty, burning with the need for moisture. So idle. It moves to the mind, it. Thirst drives men mad. Callias heard men screaming in the night, calling for water that was not there. He heard men weeping, their voices thin and cracked. He heard men praying the gods who had long since abandoned them. He lay on his back, looking up at the stars. They were bright and cold, indifferent to the suffering below. He thought of Hephaestion. He wondered if Hephaestion was safe on the coast. He wondered if Hephaestion was eating fresh bread, drinking cool wine, sleeping in a tent with a roof that did not leak. He wondered if Hephaestion remembered him. He wondered if Hephaestion thought of him as a hero, or as a casualty. HT was a sharp pain in his chest, sharper than the thirst. Hephaestion was the only one who had understood them, the only one who had stood between Alexander and the army, buffering the king's erratic moods, calming the soldiers' fears. Without Hephaestion, Alexander was a storm without a rudder, and the army was the sea, churning and terrified. The desert took its toll in silence. Bodies were left where they fell. It was no time for burial. There was no time for mourning. The living had to move. If they stopped, they would join the dead, and the dead were already a burden they could not carry. Callias walked over the bones of a horse, its ribs exposed to the sky, its skull grinning up at him. He did not look down. He kept his eyes forward. He focused on the back of the man in front of him. He focused on the rhythm of his own breathing. In, out, in, out. It was a prayer. It was a mantra. It was the only thing that kept him human. Weeks passed. The landscape did not change. It was all the same. Red sand, black rock, blue sky. The heat was a constant, oppressive presence, a hand pressing down on their shoulders, forcing them lower, forcing them to crawl. Some men crawled. They had lost the strength to stand. They dragged themselves forward on their elbows, their faces buried in the sand, leaving trails of blood and dust behind them. Callias tried to help them. He tried to lift them, but he was too weak himself. His arms shook, his legs buckled. He had to use his spear to pull himself forward, step by agonizing step. He thought of the Nanda Empire. He thought of the 6,000 elephants. He thought of the iron weapons. He realized, with a sudden shake, lane clarity, that they had not been defeated by the elephants. They had been defeated by the distance, by the scale. The Namdas were not just an army, they were a civilization. A vast, ancient, and wealthy civilization that did not need to conquer the world. They simply needed to endure, and they had endured. They had waited for the Macedonians to exhaust themselves. They had let the heat and the hunger do their weight. RK. The Nandas were the true iron wall. Not the Macedonian phalanx, but the land itself. The land had rejected them. Alexander knew this. Callias could see it in the way the king's head hung low. He could see it in the way he no longer gave orders. He no longer shouted. He no longer pointed. He simply rode, and the men followed. It was a funeral procession, a march of the living dead toward the edge of the world, and yet they did not mutiny. They did not turn on their king. They did not kill him. They simply walked, and in that walking there was a strange, terrible dignity. They had failed to conquer India. They had failed to reach the ends of the earth, but they had survived the desert, and that, in itself, was a kind of victory. The air began to change. It was subtle at first, a shift in the wind, a hint of moisture, a smell that was not dust, but salt. Callias sniffed the air. He tasted it. Salt. The sea. They were close. The end of the desert was near. A murmur went through the ranks. It was not a cheer, it was a sigh, a release of tension that had been held for weeks. Men looked up. They looked at the horizon, and there, shimmering in the distance, was the glint of water. The Hydaspes River, or the sea. It did not matter. It was water, and water was life. Hope is a dangerous thing. It can be more painful than despair. Because despair accepts death, hope promises survival. And when that survival is threatened, the fall is harder. Callias felt the hope rise in his chest, a fragile, trembling thing. He wanted to believe it. He wanted to believe that they would make it, that they would find Hephaestion, that they would find ships, that they would find home. But he kept his face blank. He kept his feet moving. He did not let himself hope too loudly, because hope could break. And if it broke, he would have nothing left. They reached the banks of the Indus on a day that felt like a dream. The river was wide and fast, churning with white water, carrying the silt of the Himalayas down to the sea. And there, spanning the river, were the bridges, massive wooden structure, as built by Hephaestion's engineers, reinforced with stone and iron. And along the banks, ships waited, triremes, supply vessels, barges. The sight of them was overwhelming. Callias fell to his knees. He did not mean to. His legs simply gave out. He pressed his face into the wet sand. He wept, not for joy, but for relief. The relief of a man who has been drowning and has finally found solid ground. Hephaestion was here. He stood on the shore, watching them arrive. He was thinner than Callias remembered. His face was lined with the stress of command, his eyes dark with exhaustion, but he was alive. He was whole. He saw Callias. He saw the line of soldiers, and he smiled. It was a small, tired smile, but it was warm. It was the smile of a brother, of a friend, of a man who had held the line while the world burned. Callias struggled to his feet. He walked toward Hephaestion. He did not speak. He could not. His throat was too dry. He simply reached out and took Hephaestion's hand. The grip was strong, solid, real. Hephaestion squeezed his hand, and in that squeeze, Callias felt the iron wall reform. Not the wall of armor and spears, but the wall of brotherhood, of shared suffering, of loyalty that transcended rank and glory. They had survived. They were together. And for now, that was enough. The reunion was quiet. There were no parades, no celebrations. The army was too weak for that. They collapsed into the shade of the ships. They drank water until they were sick. They drank water until they were sick. They ate dried fish and bread until their stomachs cramped. They slept for days. They slept in the sand, on the decks, in the tents. They slept with their armor on, their hands on their weapons, their eyes closed but their minds still scanning for danger. They were ghosts, but they were alive. Alexander did not join them immediately. He stayed on his horse for a long time, looking at the river, at the bridges, at the ships. He looked at Hephaestion, and for a moment the mask slipped. Callias saw it. He saw the fear in the king's eyes, the fear that he had lost them, the fear that he had pushed them too far, the fear that he was alone. Hephaestion walked over to him. He did not bow. He did not salute. He simply stood beside him. And Alexander leaned his head against Hephaestion's shoulder, just for a second, just long enough to let go, and then he straightened up, and the king was back, the Iron King, the conqueror. But the iron wall was changed. It was no longer shiny and new. It was scarred. It was rusted. It was bent. But it was still standing. The army was no longer the invincible force that had crossed the Hellespont. They were fewer in number. They were weaker in body. They were haunted by the memory of the desert and the elephants. But they were united. United in their survival. United in their return. As the ships set sail, carrying them north, up the Indus, toward the lands they had conquered, Callias looked back at the desert. He did not feel triumph. He felt sorrow. He felt the weight of the dead. He felt the cost of ambition. They traveled up the Indus, building roads, securing forts, laying the groundwork for the return to Babylon. Hephaestion worked tirelessly. He organized the logistics. He managed the supplies, kept the army moving. He was the anchor. Alexander was the sail, and the army was the hull. Without Hephaestion, they would have drifted. Without Alexander, they would have had no direction. Together, they had crossed the world. And now, they were coming home. The journey was slow. The men were weak. The horses were thin. But they moved. They did not stop. They did not turn back. They walked toward the river. They walked toward the bridges. They walked toward the unknown. Callias walked. He thought of Pella. He thought, of the olive groves. He thought of the cool wine. He thought of the simple life. He thought of the friends he had lost. He thought of the friends he had left behind. He thought of the future. He did not know what the future held. He did not know if he would see his home again. He did not know if he would see his mother again. He did not know if he would see Hephaestion again. But he knew that he was walking, knew that he was not alone. The river Indus loomed ahead. It was wide and fast. It was a barrier, but it was also a bridge. Hephaestion had been working on the bridges. He had been building. He had been creating order from chaos. He had been the anchor. Callias looked at the river. He saw the ships. He saw the bridges. He saw the activity. He saw the hope. He smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real. The iron wall was broken, but they were still alive. And for now, that was enough. The story of their conquest ended here, on the banks of the Hydaspes, in the heat, in the mud, in the fear. The days blurred into weeks. The landscape changed. The lush green of the jungle gave way to the dry, golden plains of the Punjab. The air became drier. The heat became sharper. The men grew thinner. The horses grew weaker. The elephants grew old and tired. But they moved. They did not stop. They did not turn back. They walked toward the river. They walked towards the bridges. They walked toward the unknown. The night fell. The jungle breathed. And the long way home began. The Gedrosian desert was behind them. The Nanded Empire was behind them. The elephants were behind them. All that remained was the road. The long, dusty, sun-baked road back to Babylon. Back to the city of mud brick and glazed blue tiles. Back to the place where the empire would begin to fracture. back to the place where Hephaestion would die, back to the place where Alexander would break. But that is a story for another time. For now, rest. Let the heat fade. Let the fear sleep. Let the memory of the iron wall drift away into the darkness. Sleep now. The river flows. The stars watch. And you are safe. You are home. The silence in Babylon was not the silence of the desert. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. It was the silence of a held breath. The air in the great palace was thick with the scent of burning cedar and sweet myrrh. It was a scent meant to mask the smell of decay, but Callias, now an old man, sitting on a stool in the shadow of a colonnade, could smell the rot beneath the perfume. He remembers the heat of India. He remembered the mud of the Hydaspes, and he remembered the friend who had held the world together. Hephaestion. The name was a stone in the throat of the army. It happened so quickly. The fever had taken him in a single night. One moment, Hephaestion was laughing. He was drinking with the king as they had done since they were boys in Pella. The next moment, he was burning. The fire was high. The smoke rose into the starless sky of Babylon. And Alexander broke. Callias had seen the king weep. He had seen the man who had conquered the known world fall to his knees in the dust. The iron wall of Alexander's will had cracked, and once a wall cracks, the wind finds its way in. The grief was volcanic, and was not a quiet sadness. It was a rage against the gods. Alexander had defeated armies. He had crossed rivers. He had climbed mountains. But he could not stop a fever. He could not stop time. He ordered the doctor executed. He cut his own hair. He declared a month of mourning. The city of Babylon, usually loud with merchants and soldiers, fell into a hush. The soldiers who had followed him from Greece to India looked at their king with fear. They saw the madness in his eyes. They saw the man who was no longer one of them. He was becoming something else, something distant, something divine. And the Macedonians did not like gods. They liked men. They liked friends. They liked Hephaestion. Callias remembered the last time he had seen Hephaestion. It was before the fever. They were walking along the Euphrates. The sun was setting, painting the water in shades of gold and purple. Hephaestion had stopped and looked at the body. River, he had said, "We have come so far, Callias, but I wonder if we have come too far." Callias had laughed. He had said, "We are the iron wall. Nothing stops us." Hephaestion had smiled, but it was a sad smile. He had said, "Even iron rusts, Callias. Even in the dry air of Babylon, iron rusts." The rust was setting in. It was not just in the armor, it was in the spirit of the army. The men were tired. They were optimistic. They wanted to go home to Macedon. They wanted to feel the cool wind of the north. They wanted to see the olive groves, but Alexander was planning new campaigns. He was talking of Arabia. He was talking of the Pillars of Hercules. He was talking of a world that ended in the west. But Callias and the others had already seen the end of the world. They had seen the Hydaspes. They had seen the elephants. They knew that the world did not end. It just got bigger and harder and hotter. Alexander's behavior grew more erratic. He began to wear Persian dress. He demanded that his soldiers bow to him. The Proskyneses, the Macedonians, hated it. It was a foreign custom. It was a sign that he was forgetting his roots. He was mixing the cultures. He was marrying a Persian princess. He was filling his army with Persian youths, the old generals. The men who had fought with him at Granicus and Gaugamela watched with growing unease. They felt like strangers in their own camp. The unity that had held them together was fraying. The iron wall was no longer solid. It was a wall of cracks. The end came not with a battle. It came with a drink. It was 323 BCE. Alexander had been drinking for 2 days. He was celebrating a naval victory in the Mediterranean, but he was weak. The fever that had killed Hephaestion left a mark on him. He was sweating, he was shivering, he was delirious. He drank a large cup of wine, then another, and then he collapsed. He fell onto his bed. He could not speak. He He could not move. The generals gathered around him. They asked him, "To whom do you leave your kingdom?" Alexander looked at them. His eyes were cloudy. He tried to speak. He whispered, "To the strongest." And then he died. The room was silent. The candles flickered, and the greatest empire in history ended with a whisper. And there was no dramatic last word, no grand decree. Just a man, alone in the dark, dying in a foreign city. The empire fractured immediately. It was like a glass vase dropped on stone. It shattered into pieces. The generals, the diadochi, the successors, too, rend on each other. They fought for the scraps of Alexander's world. They fought for Egypt, for Asia, for Macedon. They fought until they were hollow. The unity was gone. The iron wall was broken into shards, and the soldiers, the men who had followed Alexander from Pella to India, were left without a leader. They were just men, tired men, old men. Callias was one of them. He was old now. His back was bent. His hands were scarred from the spear. He looked at the map of the world. It was divided. The lines were drawn in blood, but while the west tore itself apart, something else was happening in the east, in the land of the Nandas, in the Gangetic plains. The Nanda Empire had not fallen to Alexander. It had endured, and now it was rising again. A new man had emerged from the shadows, a man named Chandragupta, and a man named Chanakya. They were not Greeks, they were Indians, and they were ambitious. Saw the weakness of the Nandas. They saw the confusion in the west, and they saw an opportunity. Chanakya was a scholar, a strategist, a man of sharp wit and sharper mind. He had been insulted by the Nanda king. He had sworn revenge. He had found Chandragupta, a young prince in hiding. He had trained him. He had taught him how to rule, how to fight, how to build an empire. And now, they were ready. They gathered an army. Not the small, exhausted band of Macedonians, but a massive force, a force of hundreds of thousands, a force of elephants, a force of iron. The Nanda Empire was vast. It was rich, was powerful, but it was corrupt. The Nanda king was cruel. He had alienated his people. He had taxed them into poverty. And when Chandragupta marched on the capital Pataliputra, the people did not fight for the Nandas. They opened the gates. They welcomed the new king. The Nanda dynasty fell, not to a Greek invader, but to its own people, to a Nadi uprising. The iron wall of Macedon had been stopped by the sheer weight of India, and now the iron of India was being forged into something new, something stronger. The Mauryan Empire was born. It was the largest empire in Indian history. It stretched from the Himalayas to the Bay of Bengal, from the borders of Persia to the deep south. It was an empire of peace, of trade, of culture. Chandragupta ruled with wisdom. He built roads, he built hospitals, he built a bureaucracy that was efficient and fair. Yet he kept the memory of the Greeks at bay. He did not fear them. He ignored them. They were a distant memory, a whisper from the west. The Mauryas were focused on their own destiny. Callias heard rumors of this new empire. He heard stories of a king who had defeated the Greeks. He heard stories of a land of such wealth that it made the gold of Sardis look like dust. He did not envy them. He did not fear them. He felt a strange sense of pride. He had been there. He had seen the power of the Nandas. He had seen it on. And he knew that the Macedonians had not conquered India. They had merely touched it, and the touch had left a mark. But the mark was small. The elephant had brushed them away. The legacy of Alexander's invasion was not a conquest. It was a meeting. It was a collision of two worlds, two civilizations that had never met before. The Greek world of the city-state, the individual, the philosopher, the soldier, and the Indian world of the empire, the caste, the dharma, the spiritual. They were different. They were opposite. And yet they had touched. And in that touch, something changed. The Greeks brought their art to the East. They brought their philosophy. They brought their style of sculpture. And the Indians gave them back their wonder, their mystery, their scale. The Hellenistic world was born from this collision. It was a world of fusion, of hybrid cultures, of new ideas. But for the soldiers, for the men like Callias, there was no grand legacy. There was only the memory. The memory of the heat, the memory of the rain, the memory of the elephants, the memory of the friend who had died, the memory of the king who had broken, the memory of the wall that had held, and the memory of the wall that had fallen. The iron wall was gone. That was E's story remained. It was told in the taverns of Macedon, was told in the markets of Babylon, was told in the temples of India, was a story of ambition, of hubris, of the limits of human power. The Nanda Empire itself did not last forever. It was eventually replaced by the Gupta Empire centuries later, but the memory of the power that stopped Alexander remained. In the Indian traditions, Alexander was not a hero. He was a curiosity, a distant king, a man who had come so far and then turned back. He was a footnote, a small ripple in the vast ocean of Indian history. The Mauryas, the Guptas, the Mughals, the British. Empires rose, empires fell. But the land remained, the elephants remained, the heat remained, the spirit of the East endured. Alexander's empire was a flash in the pan. It burned bright, it burned hot, but it burned out. It was too big, it was too fast. It was built on the backs of exhausted men, and on the will of one man. When that man died, the empire died. It could not survive without him. It was not a true state. It was a personal possession, and possessions can be lost. Empires must be built on something stronger, on law, on culture, on the will of the people. Callias lived to be an old man. He died in Pella. He died dead in his bed. He died surrounded by his family. He died with a smile on his face. He had seen the world. He had walked the earth. He had faced the elephants. He had faced the end of the world. And he had survived. He had gone home. He had found peace. He had found the cool wind of the north. He had found the taste of dry bread and cool wine. He had found the simple, clean life that he had left behind. And he was happy. Pi. The iron wall is a legend now. It is a metaphor. It is a cautionary tale. It tells us that no matter how strong we are, no matter how disciplined we are, no matter how determined we are, there are limits, there are boundaries, there are forces that are larger than us, and we must respect them. We must listen to the voices of our own humanity. We must listen to the whispers of the wind. We must listen to the rumble of the earth. So let the story settle, let the heat fade, let the fear sleep, let the memory of the iron wall drift away into the darkness. You are safe. You are home. The river flows, the stars watch, and the elephants are far away. They are in the jungle. They are in the mist. They are in the dream. Sleep now, let the weight of the sun lift from her shoulders. Let the heavy armor fall to the ground. Let the spear rest against the wall. You have walked far. You have fought hard. You've seen wonders. And now, you can rest. The journey is over. The return is complete. You are home. Warm good night. The water flows east. It flows to the ocean. It flows to the memory. It flows to the silence. And in that silence, there is peace. There is rest. There is the end of the story. In the beginning of your sleep. See your eyes. Breathe in. Breathe out. Let the jungle fade. Let the desert fade. Let the city fade. Let the world fade. And let the darkness hold you. Good night.